The night rain poured down on the city like weary sighs. In a small diner at the corner, the dim yellow light cast shadows on the slender figure of Lyra Bennett, a black waitress cleaning up after a nearly 12-hour shift. Her hands were red, her feet aching, but she kept working diligently, as if it were the last way to hold on to her dignity. When Lyra looked up, she froze. Outside the glass door, a small boy stood shivering in the rain. His clothes were soaked, hair clinging to his forehead, eyes filled with panic. Lyra didn't think twice. She opened the door, pulled him in, wrapped him in a towel, dried his hair, and placed him near the heater. No questions, no suspicion. She quickly toasted a few slices of bread, reheated a leftover bowl of soup. Warmth filled the diner. The boy, trembling, held the spoon and ate each bite, his eyes gradually softening. Lyra just sat there silently, smiling. It wasn't pity. It was humanity. She didn't know that across the street, in a dark-colored car, a man was watching through the rain-streaked glass. Raymond Holt, a cold-hearted billionaire who only believed in transactions, was observing her care for his own son, Daniel, as if tending to her own child. Daniel, who was autistic and had motor difficulties, had just wandered off from his security team. Raymond didn't intervene. He wanted to see if there were still people in this world who showed kindness without expecting anything in return. And he witnessed it in every quiet gesture of Lyra. When the assistant came to pick up Daniel, Lyra simply smiled, without complaint, without asking for gratitude. Raymond quietly left. The final look he gave her, silent, slightly stirred, a bowl of soup, a piece of toast, a warm heart in the cold, rainy night, and a destiny that began to change. Raymond Holt was a man who had gone through nearly his entire life without ever believing in the concept of kindness. In his world, everything came with a price. Compassion, if it existed at all, was merely part of a transaction, a commodity exchanged for gain. He had witnessed people smiling under the spotlight, only to hide cold calculations behind the curtain. Life had taught him that to survive, to lead, one could not afford to be soft, and kindness was a dangerous form of softness. But on that rainy night, when he saw that small waitress, Lyra Bennett, kneel down to dry hair, cover with a coat, and hand a bowl of hot soup to his son, without knowing who the boy was, without asking questions, expecting nothing in return, something inside Raymond Holt began to stir. Silently, slowly, like a tiny crack in a wall once thought to be unbreakable. Daniel, the child he loved but never knew how to embrace, had fallen asleep in the arms of a stranger. A woman with no reputation, no money, no Ivy League degree, but who had something he had never possessed: unconditional gentleness. When Nora carried Daniel out of the diner, Raymond did not step out of the car. He just sat there, silently watching the thin girl see the boy off with a light gaze, then returned to cleaning up as if no one had witnessed the act of kindness she had just performed. That gaze never once lifted toward the luxury car across the street. She had no idea who she had run into, and it was that very fact that made Raymond feel indebted. Not a material debt, but another kind. A kind he had never conceived of needing to repay. A moral debt. The kindness she had given his son made him, for the first time, feel lacking. She had done what he, as the biological father, should have done. "Tell me who she is," Raymond said to Nora as the car started moving. His voice was low and firm, but there was something unusual in it. Not anger, not command, but more like an emotion not yet formed. Nora, the assistant who had worked with him for over a decade, immediately understood this was not a mere work-related request. He wanted to know about this girl, not to thank her, but to act in the way a man like him would, to repay a debt with power, by doing something concrete, practical, clear, and measurable. Just a few hours later, all the information about Lyra Bennett was placed on the desk in Raymond's penthouse. 27 years old, unmarried, living alone in a shabby rented room in the poor southern part of the city. Father died early. Mother seriously ill back in their hometown. Lyra dropped out in her second year of university due to inability to pay tuition. She worked multiple jobs at once to survive. No savings, no connections, no one backing her. And amidst all that, she still opened the door to a strange child on a rainy night, dried his hair, baked him cookies, and covered him with her old coat so he could sleep well. Without knowing anyone was watching. Without knowing the boy was the son of a billionaire. Raymond stared at the file for a long time. He said nothing, but his eyes, usually as cold as steel, now gleamed with a distant thought. This was not pity, nor was it gratitude. For Raymond, what prompted him to act was never pure emotion. It was principle. That girl had made him feel unbalanced, and he needed to restore that balance in his own way. He didn't think about sending money, nor about repaying in a charitable sense. Those things were too small and temporary. He wanted to change her circumstances in a real way. An invitation, an opportunity, a door into a world she had never dared dream of. For Raymond Holt, this world operated by power. And now, he wanted to use that power to respond to something he never thought he would owe, an unconditional act of kindness. Tomorrow, he would meet her again, not as a father, but as a man who owed her something greater than thanks. And he would repay that debt, the only way a man like him knew how. Lyra returned to her rented room when dawn was near. Her wet shoes squeaked softly with each step along the third-floor hallway. The old lodging building nestled in a damp alley. The musty smell from the water-stained walls clung to her with every step. Her body exhausted from fatigue, Lyra only wanted to lie down, to take one long, burden-free breath. But all hope of rest halted the moment she looked up and saw the man standing in front of her door. He was unmistakable. Silver hair meticulously combed, an expensive suit tailored to perfection down to every stitch. Shiny leather shoes gleamed under the faint yellow glow of the ceiling bulb. But what left Lyra frozen wasn't his appearance. It was his eyes. The eyes she had seen the night before, through the rain, from the black car parked across the street. The silent gaze that had followed her every move, saying nothing, yet filled with questions. "Miss Lyra Bennett," he spoke deep and firm. Lyra gently nodded, hands still clutching her bag strap, confused and cautious. "I'm Raymond Holt." Her heart skipped a beat. That name wasn't unfamiliar. Holt Dynamics, a financial empire with satellite corporations spanning technology, manufacturing, and real estate, was a name she had occasionally come across while scrolling news feeds, like a distant, cold symbol that never belonged to her world. "My son, Daniel, was the boy you helped last night," Raymond continued, his eyes calm, though there was a trace of something almost uneasy. "I didn't do anything, you did more than you think." Without waiting for her to respond, he opened a leather briefcase, pulled out a thick envelope, and placed it on the rickety wooden table inside her room just as she opened the door. The room was simple, cramped, almost devoid of anything of value. A thin mattress on the floor, an old bookshelf, a small electric stove in the corner, everything laid bare before the eyes of a powerful man. Yet he showed no contempt, only silence. "This isn't money," he said, as if reading Lyra's questioning look. "It's an invitation." She took the envelope, hands slightly trembling. The letter was printed on thick, smooth paper, the scent of fresh ink still intact. Sharp text: "Official invitation to work at Holt Dynamics. Position: Community Social Project Coordination Assistant." Lyra read it again and again, unable to believe her eyes. She had never dreamed of a job at a place like Holt Dynamics. With unfinished education and little experience beyond waiting tables, deliveries, and caregiving, she had never thought such a door could open for her. "Why me?" she asked, trying to suppress the confusion inside. Raymond looked at her, not avoiding her gaze. "Because I want to repay a debt, not the way others do. My way. You gave my son something money could never buy." I can't forget Daniel's eyes that night. Lyra remained silent. Inside her, a flood of emotions swirled. Doubt, fear, emotion, and a trace of hope. "You don't have to answer right now," he said. But I think you understand, some opportunities never come twice. He turned away, but just before stepping past the doorway, he paused. The first meeting is Monday morning. Address and time are in the letter. The choice is yours. The door closed. Lyra stood still in the small room, hands still gripping the letter. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but because for the first time in years, another door had just slightly opened. She knew well that reason was warning her. Be careful, don't trust, don't dream. But something in Raymond's eyes, the look of a stirred father, shook her heart. And then, as dawn broke, Lyra made her choice. She would step into that world, though not knowing where it would lead. But she knew, if she didn't try, she would forever be the waitress from that rainy night. Lyra wore a simple white shirt and a gray skirt she had carefully ironed the night before. Though not new, it was the most proper outfit she had. Standing in front of the towering glass building named Holt Dynamics, her palms were sweating. Her breath was rapid. Inside that building was a world she had never imagined stepping into. A place of people bearing titles like doctor, CEO, investor, along with luxury watches and prestigious diplomas from the world's top universities. Lyra stepped through the revolving door, head held high, though her heart pounded fast in her chest. The moment she appeared, the first gazes turned toward her, not out of impression, but out of surprise. They looked at her neatly tied curly hair, her brown skin, her makeup-free face. They looked at her unbranded clothes, her slightly hesitant walk. In their eyes, she was something out of place in this polished world. No one said a word, but Lyra clearly felt the heavy silence each time she walked by. She heard whispers, quick glances that turned away. She had no MBA, hadn't graduated from Harvard or Stanford. She was Raymond Holt's person, but no one understood why he brought a diner waitress into this place. In the elevator, while the other colleagues exchanged business cards, talked about stocks and trips to Europe, Lyra simply stood still. She had nothing to boast about. Only hands that had washed thousands of dishes, feet that had delivered food in the rain, and memories of a life where every coin came from sweat. When she reached the office, she was surprised to see Nora again, the woman who had come to pick up Daniel the other day. But this time, Nora was no longer Auntie, but the company's head of external affairs. Though surprised, Nora smiled gently, then led her on a brief tour of the departments. Lyra didn't know what Nora was thinking, but she sensed a bit of warmth in that gaze, unlike the others. Perhaps Nora, too, had once been surprised by Raymond's decision. But now, she chose to observe rather than judge. By the end of that morning, Lyra was invited to Raymond Holt's office. The room was on the top floor, surrounded by transparent glass, overlooking the entire city, like a king surveying his domain. Raymond stood by the window, back straight, light casting sharp lines on his stern face. "Sit down," he said without preamble. Lyra sat, clasping her hands tightly in her lap, trying to remain calm. "I know the first day isn't easy," he said, "and I also know you'll be doubted, but I didn't bring you here to be an assistant or to make coffee." He pulled a file from his drawer and pushed it toward her. "The Richmond plant expansion project is under pressure from investors who want to move the entire production line overseas to cut costs. That means hundreds of workers in Richmond will lose their jobs. They've worked for this company for 10, 15 years. Lyra looked at the stack of documents, not yet fully comprehending, before he continued. "I want you to present the case for keeping the plant, to convince them, not just with emotion, but with data, with strategy. You have 2 days to prepare." Lyra froze. This wasn't a symbolic task. This was a real and extremely difficult challenge. She wasn't an economist, let alone someone with experience negotiating with international investors. But the look in Raymond's eyes gave her no other choice. "Why me?" she asked, her voice nearly a whisper. Raymond looked at her for a moment. "Because I saw you didn't sit still when someone needed help. And because those workers are also standing in the rain, just like my son once did." Lyra said nothing more. She left the office with the file in hand, her legs still trembling. But for the first time, amid the doubtful gazes, she began to feel something shifting inside her, a quiet voice whispering that perhaps she deserved to take the next step. That morning, the top floor of Holt Dynamics was brightly lit, with cold yellow lights reflecting off a long walnut table. In the large boardroom, men and women in expensive suits sat neatly, each with a laptop in front of them and neatly stacked color-printed documents. They were influential names in the financial market, strategic shareholders, major investors, global planning experts. At the head of the table, Philip Langford, a finance tycoon from London, sat imposingly, his cold face bearing a constant look of boredom. He was the one leading the proposal to move the entire production line from the Richmond plant to a Southeast Asian country to cut labor costs and increase profit margins. The figures he presented were sharp, dry, and emotionless. To him, workers were merely costs. Reduce costs, increase profit, as simple as a calculation in an Excel sheet. When Lyra entered the room, the atmosphere suddenly shifted. A black woman, petite, dressed far more modestly than the polished appearances of the others. Glances began to exchange silently, skeptical, condescending, even slightly mocking. No one knew who she was. And even more, no one understood why Raymond Holt had brought someone like her into this room. Raymond sat silently at the far end of the table, saying nothing. He simply watched Lyra walk to the prepared seat, clutching a bundle of documents. No secretary introduction, no formal opening. She began with a slow but clear voice. "My name is Lyra Bennett. I don't have an MBA. I also didn't come from the Ivy League. But I've spent the past 2 days studying every page of the materials related to the Richmond plant, and I'd like to present a different perspective." For the first few seconds, no one reacted. But then, as if drawn in by her calm rhythm, the whole room fell silent and listened. Lyra presented a detailed analysis showing that while moving the plant abroad might reduce labor costs, it would bring major risks in quality, logistics, brand trust, and social impact. She cited specific examples. A 17% increase in transportation costs in similar projects. Negative consumer reactions when large corporations were accused of cutting domestic jobs, and even legal consequences from losing local tax incentive policies. Richmond isn't just a manufacturing site, she said, her voice growing sharper. It's home to 846 workers who've been loyal to the company for over a decade. It's a place with families, schools, hospitals depending on the wages from this plant. If we leave, we don't just lose a factory, we lose a loyal community. Philip Langford furrowed his brows, cutting in. "You think we run businesses with emotions?" Lyra didn't back down. "No, Mr. Langford, I'm talking about strategy. Loyalty is a long-term asset. The cost savings today may become greater losses in the future if the brand is associated with ruthlessness." Then she concluded with a 5-year scenario projection. One scenario if the plant was relocated, and one if Richmond was retained with a strategy of upgrading machinery and increasing productivity instead of cutting staff. The final figures showed net profits differed by only 2%, but preserved nearly all brand value and market trust. The room fell silent. Philip Langford stared at the spreadsheet, then looked up at Lyra. His face no longer carried the arrogance from earlier. He leaned back, arms crossed. No one said anything else. A few shareholders whispered. One slowly nodded. Raymond Holt remained still, but at the corner of his mouth, a barely visible smile appeared. It wasn't a triumphant smile, but one of acknowledgement. He had been right. Right to believe that courage, sharpness, and an unyielding spirit weren't found in degrees or status, but in the heart. The meeting ended. Many left with a very different look from when they had entered. As for Lyra, she stood quietly in the vast room, still holding the report, but for the first time no longer feeling small inside. In just one night, everything changed at a dizzying pace. That early morning, Lyra walked into the office carrying the confidence of someone who had just made a strong impression in the upper-level boardroom. But before she could even sit down at her desk, she was summoned to internal affairs. No explanation, No friendly faces, just cold expressions and a thick envelope placed right in front of her as she stepped into the windowless room. Inside the envelope was a printout of a chain of emails. The subject line was clear: forwarding confidential documents about the production relocation plan, Holt Dynamics, Richmond plant. The content revealed that strategic information had been leaked to the outside. The electronic trail identified the sender's account as that of Lyra Bennett. Lyra was stunned. Everything in her mind froze. She flipped through each page, reading every emotionless line, unable to utter a word. She knew for certain she had never sent any such email. Yet the printouts, the timestamps, the IP address, all pointed directly at her, as if someone had orchestrated everything beforehand, step by step, with meticulous cruelty. "Do you have anything to say?" the investigator asked coldly. Lyra took a deep breath. She knew exactly where she stood. A woman of color, with no background, no connections, standing before people who found it easier to assign blame to the weak. If she stayed silent, it would mean she was guilty. If she defended herself without proof, she'd be seen as defiant. In a power structure like Holt Dynamics, she had little chance to defend herself, but she did not collapse. "I didn't send that email," she said, eyes locked on the investigator. "Someone set me up, and I will find out who did it." That very afternoon, rumors spread throughout the company. Raymond Holt's girl had betrayed him. The waitress who was given a chance is now exposed. The whispers, the averted gazes, the sudden silences whenever she walked by, it all returned like a haunting echo. Lyra sat alone in her office, the light outside the window fading, her heart full of helplessness. But just then, the door burst open. Raymond walked in, holding a folder, his face tense with restrained emotion. "I've seen everything," he said, straight to the point. Lyra clenched her hands, bracing for the worst. But Raymond didn't look at her like a traitor. He looked at her like someone who was wounded. "I don't believe you did this," he said slowly, "but I need you to prove it, not just for yourself, but for everything you've worked so hard to build." Those words were like a warm breath breaking through the ice forming in Lyra's chest. Raymond hadn't turned his back on her. He hadn't chosen silence like the others. He had chosen to stand by her. That night, they began retracing the steps. Lyra and Nora, the only colleague who still held faith in her, reviewed all access logs, internal permissions, and analyzed every line of code sent from the system. The following days were a string of tense, silent, relentless hours. Amid dense data and trace charts, they began to notice anomalies. An unauthorized login to Lyra's account from another device, exactly during the window when the email was sent. A strange IP address that matched with someone from the senior management floor. The truth began to surface, little by little, and with every clue, Lyra's pain was both soothed and deepened. Someone had deliberately tried to push her off the path she had struggled so hard to enter, and she knew she had to expose it all. Not just to save herself, but to prove that no one could be buried simply because of a humble beginning. She was no longer alone. For the first time, that powerful man had stepped out of the shadows of the transactional world to stand for justice, not out of pity, but because he had seen the truth in her eyes since that very first rainy night. And now, they would go all the way together to uncover the one who had staged that vile scheme. In the long, tense days following the email leak, Lyra and Nora didn't stop for even a second. They worked quietly in the small room at the end of the 12th floor hallway, where no one paid attention to their presence anymore. The eyes of most colleagues had now turned to indifference or disdain. But amid that coldness, Lyra held on to her faith, because Raymond still believed in her, and because she herself knew she was innocent. Nora was the first to trace the unusual activity in the login system. An unauthorized access to Lyra's email account was recorded at midnight from an internal IP address not linked to any of her devices. Together, they followed that clue, cracked each layer of encryption, and traced the intruder's path. It took days before they found a hidden system log, a piece of deleted data not yet fully overwritten. In it, the command line clearly appeared, forwarding emails from Lyra's account to an external address. The source was a personal computer registered under the name Eric Calloway, a veteran executive, once Raymond's right-hand man for over a decade. Eric had high-level access, had overseen many of the company's strategic operations directly, and was also one of the first to oppose Lyra's presence at Holt Dynamics. Since her arrival, Eric had always maintained a calm face, but his gaze never hid his discomfort. Lyra held the copies of the evidence, her heart heavy as stone. Though she had mentally prepared herself, discovering that the traitor was someone close to Raymond brought both pain and fury. She didn't say anything to him right away. She simply walked toward the boardroom, where the monthly meeting was taking place, and where she had never imagined she would enter as a challenger. The boardroom door swung open. The entire board looked up when Lyra appeared. Her simple gray suit didn't make her stand out, but her eyes no longer held fear. She stepped in, placed the file on the table, without any formal greeting. "Before you continue," she said, "I would like to present evidence regarding the recent document leak for which I have been accused." No one spoke to stop her. The atmosphere suddenly dropped. Lyra presented every detail, every trace log, every system log copy, leading to an undeniable conclusion. Eric Calloway had used his access privileges to infiltrate her account, send fake emails, and then erase the traces. The entire act was carried out from his private office at midnight, a time when no one else was in the building. Eric turned pale. He jumped up, denying it immediately, claiming it was an elaborate smear. But in the absolute silence of the remaining board members and the unwavering gaze of Raymond, every justification became meaningless. Raymond stood, walked slowly from the head of the table toward Lyra. His eyes were cold as steel, but no longer doubtful. Only disappointment remained, not toward her, but toward the man who had once been his ally. "I once trusted you," Raymond said, his voice steady and deep, "but I cannot forgive someone willing to sacrifice the truth to protect their own power." Eric Calloway, "From this moment, you are terminated." Eric stood frozen. No one spoke for him. No nods of agreement, no eyes of sympathy. He left the room with a defeated posture, while Lyra remained standing, neither proud nor triumphant, just relieved. Raymond turned back, looking directly at the board of directors. "Lyra Bennett is not someone you can underestimate. She possesses not only courage, but a capability I have never seen in any other candidate. And today, she proved that." Then he turned to her, his gaze softening, though his voice remained firm. "You are irreplaceable at Holt Dynamics." The room was silent. But this time, there were no condescending glances, only recognition. And Lyra, once seen as an outsider, now stood firm at the center of a world that once seemed never meant for her. The schoolyard was dazzling with color on graduation day. The trees were adorned with small lights, sparkling gently under the soft afternoon sun. Rows of chairs were neatly arranged, and hundreds of people were present. Parents, teachers, students. All eyes turned toward the stage where graduates were being called up one by one to receive their diplomas. Among them was a young man, neatly combed black hair, bright eyes, and a tall, commanding presence. Daniel Holt. Daniel stepped onto the stage to resounding applause. He received his graduation diploma with steady hands. A faint smile appeared on his lips as he turned around, his gaze fixed on two people sitting in the front row, Raymond and Lyra. Lyra stood there in an elegant blue dress, her face calm but filled with emotion. Beside her, Raymond no longer carried the appearance of a man clad in the armor of power as he once did. Today he wore a simple shirt, no tie, no cold expression. His eyes followed his son with pride, and the way he looked at Lyra was gentle, like that of a kindred spirit who had walked with him through life's most pivotal turns. After the ceremony, when Daniel walked over to embrace his father, then turned and hugged Lyra tightly, it was no longer the shy, awkward embrace of the boy he once was, but the sincere affection of a grown man for the woman who once gave him warmth in the freezing rain. "Thank you for believing in me," he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. Lyra smiled, her eyes slightly red. In that moment, every distance that had ever existed vanished. Daniel's hug was the final bond that closed a long, challenging journey and opened a new chapter, not just for him, but for all of them. Raymond turned to Lyra, his voice low but warm. If you hadn't opened the door to that diner that day, I might have lost the most precious thing in my life. Lyra said nothing, but in her eyes was a whole sky of emotion that didn't need to be spoken. From a nameless waitress, she now stood not only in the family seats, but as someone who had left a profound mark on the hearts of two men once most distant, a father and his son. Less than a year after that event, Holt Dynamics made an announcement that shocked the financial world. Lyra Bennett was officially appointed as vice president of the corporation, a groundbreaking decision that shattered all outdated standards of background and status. But for those who had witnessed her journey, it was a well-deserved outcome. She not only managed social impact projects, but also founded the Carter Holt Foundation, a nonprofit organization supporting education, vocational training, and second chances for those long forgotten. Single mothers, homeless children, workers displaced by automation. The foundation was named after Lyra's mother, Carter, as a profound tribute. In her first speech as a leader, Lyra said, "I once thought I was just a quiet shadow in this city, but light doesn't create itself. It comes from trust, from courage, and sometimes simply from a hug at the right moment, or a warm bowl of soup on a cold, rainy night. I'm here today because someone once believed I deserved to keep going." Raymond sat in the audience that day. He never took his eyes off her. And for the first time in many years, he felt no need to be the one standing behind the microphone to inspire others, because he had already seen that inspiration shine so clearly in the woman standing center stage. Lyra hadn't just stepped into the world of power. She had transformed it with her own heart. Raymond Holt sat quietly in his office, the twilight casting long shadows on the glass wall behind him. His eyes gazed far off toward the horizon, where the light slowly faded to make way for the dark. On the desk was a small photo frame, a picture taken at Daniel's graduation, where the three of them stood side by side, hands clasped together, eyes shining with happiness. Between them there was no longer the distance of power, class, or doubt. Only a bond remained, something he had once thought was a luxury. He remembered that rainy night. The girl in the old apron had opened the door for his son, without a single question, without a single condition. At that time, he had sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, believing he could control the world with money and influence. But that woman, someone whose name, whose background he hadn't known, taught him something he had never truly understood in his entire life. Kindness is not weakness. It is strength. Today, looking back at it all, Raymond couldn't help but wonder, if he could return to that moment, would he have had the courage to step out of the car and bow his head to thank a poor waitress? Someone he had, deep down, once considered beneath him, not of his class. That question he had never dared answer aloud, but his actions afterward, the trust he gave Lyra, the opportunities he created not out of pity, but out of recognizing her true worth, were the deepest silent apology a man like him could offer. Across the city, in the office of the Carter Holt Foundation, Lyra Bennett was writing her speech for an upcoming conference. A cup of tea cooled beside her, but her eyes remained bright, each line of text flowing from the pen like a stream from the heart. On the wall were photos of the projects she had carried out, from classrooms for homeless children to job recovery centers for workers laid off after the pandemic. She knew she had stepped out of the darkness with her own small but steady steps. But if asked, could she have done that without Raymond Holt's unexpected invitation? Without the time he knocked on the door of her shabby room to place an envelope on that worn table that would change her entire life? And then, if she had known he once thought of kindness as a debt to be repaid, would she still have accepted? Would she have had the courage to step into his world, a world full of judgment and injustice, to prove that kindness doesn't need to be repaid, but deserves to be respected? The answer is yes, not because she forgives easily, but because she understands forgiveness is the only way not to let the past chain you down. And that forgiveness doesn't make her weak. It makes her stronger than any justification. Lyra didn't change the world with one grand gesture. She only opened the door for a little boy on a rainy night. But that act changed a father who changed an entire corporation. A corporation that now opens doors for thousands of others in vulnerable situations. And that's enough to believe. Kindness, when sown at the right time, in the right place, can create unimaginable ripples. Now, the question is no longer for Raymond or Lyra. It is for each of us, those who are reading this story, living in a world where kindness is sometimes seen as foolish, as weakness. If it were you, would you bow your head to thank someone you once looked down on? If it were you, would you dare step into the world of someone who once thought you were unworthy? Kindness cannot change the entire world in one day, but it can change one person, and one person can change the world. How would you rate this story from 0 to 10? And if your heart feels a little warmer after reading these lines, stay with us, because the stories to come might be the small flame that helps you believe there are still good things in this world waiting to be sown.